class. I'll say a little bit about the class, and then Celia is going to give you like a demo she's going to read a paper that she's workshopping right now, which is great because it means she'll get really good feedback from this audience. So we're excited about that. Okay, so I work in environmental ethics and philosophy, biology, and values in science. So environmental ethics, probably very intuitive to everybody here. Philosophy, biology might be a little bit less intuitive. It does a lot of things. One of the things it does is look at values in science, but some of the other things that it does are look at like fun, itchy conceptual problems in biology and the sciences, things about like causation and how causation works, things about like category problems, this sort of stuff. So I teach a lot of philosophy biology courses, but we're going to talk today about values in science. So I wanted to get into what we mean when we say values. I think it's often the case that science is, or at least the sciences, life sciences especially, is or at least try to be and think of themselves as striving to be value-free, right? This is a thing that at least was the case, is still maybe the case. And I want to get some language around what we mean when we say science is or tries to be value-free, or that it isn't and can't possibly be value-free. So there are two ways of thinking about what values are in the context of science. So one of them is to think about values in terms of constitutive values. And these are the values of the society in which, contextual values. These are the values of the society in which that kind of science is taking place. So these values are the obvious kinds, right? Like who's funding you? What kinds of things can you say that will be intelligible to the world, to the wider world around you? What can you not say because no one's going to really understand what you're saying? Where can you publish and what are the publishing constraints, right? So there's a lot of like not publishing negative results, right? Like you've got to publish positive results. That's like a constraint that actually limits the kinds of things that you can say, the kinds of science that you can do. So again, and then just like, what are the moral and cultural values of the society? It's gonna like, you really can't publish super straightforwardly eugenicist stuff these days. You can publish covertly eugenicist stuff, but you can't publish explicitly, right? So like this sort of thing. These are contextual values. And it's more or less the case that the scientists that I work with are like, yeah, like we get that. That's pretty obvious. We know that. We know those values. But like good science is like deep down, but value-free, or trying to be in any case. And so here's where we get to what we're calling constitutive values. Well, we're not calling them that. We're following a tradition of people like Helen Longino that have called them constitutive values. And these are the values that are the heart of what makes science and scientific inquiry what it is. So these are values like when we're structuring what science is and how it unfolds, when we're using things like the scientific method, when we're talking about objectivity, when we're trying to understand reproducibility, what truth is, predictability, how are we defining these terms, right? If I said I'm doing science, but I just walked out and made casual observations and then came back and shared them with you over drinks, you might be like, well, you're making observations, but you're not necessarily doing the work of science, right? And that's because there are certain values about how we understand and know the world that are implicit in how we understand what science is and does. And this is the level at which I work and the level at which Celia works. So we're looking at the constitutive values. What are the things that make science science? How did we arrive at those things? How could those things have been different? And how are those things different in other cultures? So I want to take a minute because I would like to hear what kinds of constitutive and contextual values you feel are constraining or enabling your own research, whether you're a scientist or maybe you're like another closeted philosopher here. I would be curious what kinds of constitutive or contextual values you find in your own work. So like maybe take a second to think about it and then like talk with a neighbor. And maybe you're like, I don't understand what we're talking about. I don't understand these terms, right? And that's fair. That would be fair. But I mean, again, if you're doing scientific research, you're thinking about reproducing, results. You're thinking about making kinds of predictions. So what do you mean when you say predictability? What do you mean when you say you're trying to be objective, right? And those are the kind of more obvious ones. So I would be open to less obvious ones as well. But that's what I'm kind of hoping to talk about for a couple of minutes. So let's just get clear on this with each other. Would you have a little conversation with your neighbors about the constitutive and or contextual values constraining your work? Go. 1, 2, 3, talk. And those online, feel free to join in.
Anything that's in the lines or chat.
Okay, I hate to pull us back so soon. I'm used to working with students, with undergraduates and graduate students who will just sit there for ages and not say anything to each other. So it's really unusual to be like, shut. Yeah. So, okay, so what did you all come up with? What are the kinds of values? Anybody? Nothing to, yes.
Where this is a good match, but I switched from natural science to more transdisciplinary work, and it wasn't until I learned about social science methods that I realized how much I struggled with hypothesis-driven research and more deductive versus inductive. And I hadn't realized that there were other ways of framing inquiry until I learned about other disciplines. I don't know if
that is such a good example of constitutive values, because those are values that don't even translate across, right, across inquiries within the same kind of tradition, right, let alone across traditions. So that's a really great hypothesis. And even how we define what a hypothesis gets to be, right, that's been like, right, constantly debated. And so yeah, that's a great example. What are some other examples? Don't be shy, I heard you talking.
There's a few that came in through the chat.
Okay.
We had funding agency priorities. One person said that,
Great.
the other person thumbs upped it. And then another person mentioned methodological biases and perspectives.
Oh.
Okay. All right. Funding agencies, 2 people. Methodological biases and perspectives, with each method having its own bias.
Yes, really great. So one of the things that we are trained to do as philosophers is help people navigate these things. So it's been really fun. I teach a class in integrative biology, and I taught it with 2 faculty, and they have 2 philosophy from integrative biology, and they have very different conceptual frameworks and methodological approaches. And sometimes they would be saying things to one another, and I'd be like, oh, I see what's happening. You actually, here's what you're saying, and here's what you're saying. You're having just different values that are structuring the kinds of conversations that you're able to have. So like you're defining hypotheses differently. That's what's going on, or this sort of thing. So these different methodological biases are right on. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes.
I feel like I'm on an Instagram reel right now with a mini mic on the street. Not to be too meta, but the statement that you just made resonated with me. I'm a social scientist by training, and I have a very well-defined understanding of what values are as like a cognitive function. And disciplinarily, it's hard for me to like make that leap to something that's a little more amorphous and not so pinned down, which offered some opportunity to reflect on, where my values are as far as like interdisciplinary expansiveness. And trying to find concrete definitions for something that might not have concrete definitions elsewhere. Yeah,
right. That's great. That's a super great example. Thank you. Yes. You do. Yes.
So following along on the comment of methodological differences, something I've been thinking about a lot lately is We in this room, for the most part, probably take a very sort of Western science approach to collecting data and to conducting science. But we are starting to come to the realization that there are these other ways of knowing, and sometimes of our own accord, and sometimes by being forced to externally. We're now collaborating with Indigenous scientists. We're collaborating with artists. We're collaborating with people who have other ways of knowing. Yet, then when you get to the end of a project and you want to go publish, there's still these disconnects, and we don't really know how to plumb this yet, I think. Like, we know we should be, as Western scientists, thinking about these other ways of knowing, but I don't think that we really know how to do it yet very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
The direct follow to that.
Which is I've done past efforts and work projects to try to weave together Indigenous, local, and Western scientific knowledge. And at the end of the day, when you're going for your publication, I think in the publishing world, there is a bias towards broadly generalizable conceptual frameworks, broadly generalizable knowledge in general. And I think so much about local and Indigenous knowledge is very place specific, and it doesn't even try to generalize beyond place specificness. So that's a challenge, I think.
Yes, well, those are perfect segues into kind of what I primarily do in my work and what we're doing in this class here. So what we're talking about when we talk about these different like regimes of knowledge are just different epistemologies. That's the fancy word that was for this, right? So an epistemology is the study of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we know things? How are we defining what truth is? Who gets to be a knower? So for a really long time, right, we did not treat Native communities as having any kind of epistemic authority. It was like this it's cute, we love it, but it's also weird and it's not science. So thank you, and thank you, but no thank you. So what we're trying to do, what I do in my work, is investigate and work with Native communities to find ways of translating those epistemologies to scientists, so that it's easier for that kind of collaborative work to happen in ways that, in ways that actually support Native sovereignty, right? And they're not just supplemental to science, which we'll get into in a minute. So traditional ecological knowledge. I also just want to say a quick caveat on this. This is actually a really hotly contested term, right? Traditional ecological knowledge. It's been called native science. There are lots of different words for this, and there are lots of political implications with how you name what it is that's happening there. So there are certain people who are working in native science who will call it native science. There are certain people who will never call it native science, that will only call it traditional ecological knowledge. And all of those have different kind of relationships to authority. So even when we're naming what it is we're talking about here, there's a really long and contentious history around that. But some of the key differences between traditional ecological knowledges or native science and kind of Western or Euro-American science. So I've just put a couple up here. So one of them is the function or the purpose of knowledge is primary, right? And it's often the case that, I mean, we just like knowing stuff, right? And also with capitalism, we need jobs, so we have to like write papers and do stuff. But we don't always take or route our knowledge through moral concerns. But in a lot of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges, knowledge means not knowing rightly. You have to kind of put these two things together. You can't separate morality and knowledge. So, well, there's knowledge, it's objective, it's true, it's just the way the world is. Now let's use it morally or immorally, right? These are sort of bound together from the beginning. So the processes of verification are also something that's really different. In part, we spoke about, right, the local versus universal. They're not striving for universal claims. They're not looking for things that are broader. They're actually often looking for quite seasonal, super specific, community-based, right, claims. And that's in part because, refer to point number one, the whole function of knowledge, right, it's a moral function. It is not knowledge over here, values over here. The point of knowing anything is to live well, right, with your community and with those around you. So the processes of verifying what is true or not true are also super, super different. And then one of my favorites is that lots of traditional ecological knowledges just are interested in defining things based on their relationships or connections. So I guess analogously would be like a more ecological way of defining things than a biological way of defining things. So a lot of biological explanations tend to be reductive, not reductionist necessarily, but they're working on explaining things in terms of their smallest component parts that then build off of one another to add together to create explanations for the whole, right? And so you kind of are working often to get down to these smaller levels of explanations. And that just lies in really intensive contrast to a lot of traditional ecological knowledges, which are not reductive. They're not interested in small component parts, but are actually principally looking at relationships as explanatory and relationships as defining. So this is something that has come up a lot in my work on invasive species, on definitions of species, on definitions of biological organisms, on all of these things. That's a really intense sticking point, or can be. So there are different ways of engaging with traditional ecological knowledge. And the one that has been dominant, but not for very long, because we haven't been doing it you haven't been engaging in traditional ecological knowledge for very long, is to treat TEK as supplemental to or supportive of scientific research. So in this position, science is sort of the best, closest way that Homo sapiens can get to accessing the world in its entirety, in its objective form. And we can use any like gaps we might have, then we phone a friend, a native friend specifically, and ask them if they have any information we could like slot into that space, right? And this is to treat TEK as supplemental to or supportive of the predominant, most authoritative form of knowledge, which is Euro-American science. But the model that I work in, and Celia and a lot of my colleagues, is a pluralist approach, which is to treat TEK, all the TEKs, right, which are also different among themselves, and science as equally valid ways and forms of knowing, and to not to treat them as supplemental. One of the challenges with this is that, as some of you were saying, we're not actually trained in Indigenous epistemologies. We're not actually trained in how they see the world. We don't, spend a lot of time talking to them. So then it comes time to be like, great, let's talk about salmon. And for them, salmon are relatives. Salmon are kin, salmon are this. And for us, salmon is a species, right? Salmon is a genetic collective, depending on how you define what a species is. Salmon is like a genetic collective. This is what it's doing here. And for them, you say salmon, I say salmon, we're not saying the same thing, right? Potato and potato are actually just completely different things here. So then how do we proceed to talk about salmon when you say that and I say that, we're just not talking about the same sorts of things? So a lot of my work, and again, at Celia's and others, is equipping students and faculty with the skills to navigate these huge epistemic and ontological differences that are kind of at the base, so that then when you get to the time of engagement, right, it's not going to just be supplemental. These can come and be like fully collaborative projects, and that is unfortunately going to mean, maybe fortunately, I forget the value judgment. It is just going to mean that there are going to be irreconcilable differences there. And that's the other thing that's really hard. With science's view of the world, it is often that we're going to get to one position that is the best one, right? We're getting closer and closer and closer to great access to reality. But the minute you include TEKs, you realize that actually there's incommensurabilities. We're not going to solve these things because these are just never going to get any closer together. They just can't. They're beginning from different assumptions. And that is, I think, something that is often really difficult for especially my professor science friends. They're like, that's hard. Nobody wants that, right? So then I just want to say a couple things about some ways that I've applied this in like a minute. So one of them is looking at the problem of how you define an organism, and how the concept of the organismality is used in different sciences for different research. And of course, we treat this in philosophy as just like a fun, tickly problem. Like, okay, there are so many different definitions, how fun, let's sit down and think about this for a really long time. And some folks think that it's a problem, that there's so many different definitions. It must mean that there might not be one real thing that it is to be an organism, right? Same thing with the species problem, same thing with biological individuality, et cetera, right? You get the idea. But that is in part because these scientists and philosophers thereof are governed by a way of understanding the world that has to do with a certain kind of logical framework, like the contradictions are bad. You can't have two things be true at the same time. But native communities actually have super interesting paraconsistent logics where you can have two things be true at the same time. Contradictions are actually super sexy in a lot of Indigenous epistemologies. So I wrote this paper like, well, actually, what would happen if we routed these problems through Indigenous logical frameworks instead of classical logic frameworks? So then I do similar things with the species concept. I've got some emerging shark conservation work that's kind of doing this sort of thing. And then, all right, I'm gonna end by introducing what we're doing here. So a lot of my work is teaching in integrative biology and forestry and in the sciences as well, to equip folks to have these kinds of conversations in ways that are richer, better, yeah, hopefully more rich, as I said. So this class is doing that with oceans and ocean science in particular. So for this, I've invited Celia, who specializes in ocean feminism, among other things, to come up here. And we've had some really rich conversations. It's a really sweet, small class. So we've just gotten to have really deep and close engagement. We're going to visit the dunes. We've been out here thinking about concepts of invasive species and how we define those. And all of those are being routed through our kind of expertise in TEK. And so I'm going to pass it over to Celia now to talk about your research on the oceans in particular.
You. All right, let me get my, I want to make sure I go over. So, yeah. Well, oh, can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Let me see if I can get this. There you go. Aloha, my name is Celia Bardwell Jones. I teach at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. I'm very excited to be here co-teaching with Rebekah here. I did my PhD work at the University of Oregon. So I lived in the Eugene area for about 8 years before, getting my job at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. So very excited. I love coming back to the Oregon coast, especially, and it's such a bright, sunny day today that it like I don't even have to wear socks today, so it's very exciting. Yes, yes. So the work that I do is on I've been thinking about a lot, given my context in Hawaii, is thinking about how human human techne, right, can affect our relationships with the environment, right, such as the oceans. And in that relationship building between humans and oceans, what kind of epistemologies, what kind of ethical orientations can be discovered through that relationship. Now, as Rebekah talked to you about before, one way of characterizing that relationship could be through a scientific discourse, right? Through scientific epistemologies, in which, the knower studies the known in very particular, highly, regulated sorts of ways, right? What I'm introducing here is a kind of alternative way of understanding the knower's relationship to the ocean, right, to the sea, and how the histories of voyaging in particular, voyaging cultures in particular in Hawaii have, helped us at least reimagine, rethink what our relationships to the oceans might look like, such that it gives us alternative frameworks to consider, right, as Western scientists, as one goes about attempting to know, the oceans, right? And I don't see this necessarily, again, as supplemental value, right, to what science is doing, but this is another alternative framework of how one comes to know the world through an Indigenous framework, particularly the work being done in Hawaii, but also in the Pacific Islands, Oceania, and all over that region. So this particular photo image here is from my friend, Brandy Nalani McDougall, who is the poet laureate at the for Hawaii. and she teaches at UH Manoa, but I really liked her image here of the ocean, which is, the cover of her book here. And she really liked it, she told me, because it has this placental kind of connection, this imagery, right, of a kind of placental connection with the seagrass, the sea fans there. And so anyways, I just wanted to highlight just images of the ocean there. So, okay, so let me begin. The creation of the Pacific Voyaging Society in 1973 and the subsequent building and sailing of the Hokulea without the use of modern navigation systems marked a paradigmatic turn in challenging the long-held racist belief that Polynesians migrated to the Hawaiian archipelago through accidental or unintentional voyaging. According to this misguided belief, navigation could hardly be used as a term to describe the accidental drifting of Polynesians, as their routes were dictated by the elements and not through rational and technical skill. Right. So, in fact, Western philosophers such as Immanuel Kant have built moral systems based within the racist assumption that the South Sea Islanders were incapable of fostering any rational or moral talents, and instead developed interests in idleness, leisure, and pleasure. Now, unfortunately, despite the successful navigation of the Hokulea and many efforts of revitalizing indigenous voyaging cultures throughout the Pacific, Maile Arvin notes that Thor Heyerdahl, a scholar who advanced racist claims about Polynesian navigation, is currently praised for his efforts in the Kontiki, right? A raft expedition that failed to prove Polynesians migrated from South America. And, Hokulea first sailed in 1976, but then in 2011, Heyerdahl's archives became officially part of the UNESCO's Memory of the World Register, which describes Heyerdahl as one of the greatest communicators and renowned explorers of the 20th century. And in fact, a film, Kontiki, in 2012, also praised Heyerdahl's impact on, quote, exploration. For Arvin, who is Native Hawaiian who lives in Utah, she teaches at the University of Utah, she argues that minimizing the rational and moral talents of Polynesians through these white settlement narratives in the Pacific have concealed histories of the Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian people, which continues to erase indigenous epistemologies of navigation. Now, my aim in this presentation is to understand how this misguided belief about Polynesian navigation is a form of epistemic injustice, noting that institutions and disciplines have historically denied the epistemic credibility of many indigenous epistemologies, thereby excluding their rich epistemic resources in advancing knowledge of traditional navigation, and also, importantly, the elemental sea. While this presentation briefly diagnoses the problems of the epistemic injustice that voyaging epistemologies have experienced in the wake of a Western colonial agenda, I chart the central epistemic dimensions or ways of knowing of voyaging and wayfinding practices in Oceania. The analysis put forward in this presentation assumes voyaging is a rich epistemic practice that involves the navigator's cognitive prowess emerging through one's embodied interaction with the sailing vessel and the elements. Opposed to a Western Anglo framework that obscures the South Sea Islanders' epistemic skills as lazy and pleasure-driven, the following analysis will demonstrate that voyaging epistemologies are thoroughly grounded within structures of reason and embodied attunement to nature. In this sense, epistemologies of voyaging adopt an environmental ethic experienced through intimate bodily interactions with nature, which elicits both a form of knowledge production and an ethical response of stewardship and care to the ocean environments and the people who inhabit the sea, right? So this knowledge production is not just describing oceans, but it is morally defining what oceans are, such that a response, a moral response, is attached to the scientific knowledge that's gathered because through interactions with the oceans. So first of all, I'd like to just kind of highlight what epistemic injustice is, especially from the experience of marginalized communities. And so in Varieties of Epistemic Injustice, Gail Polhouse argues that epistemic injustice, quote, wrongs a knower as a knower, in the sense of suppressing their testimony, distorting inquiry, and deploying institutional practices, such as discounting or discrediting intellectual traditions. Now, we know that that happens a lot in the publishing world, right? Where there's a lot of gatekeepers that determine which knowledge is counted as knowledge and which isn't counted as knowledge. So when, in this sense, we can see how epistemic injustice can be a leading cause of trauma within historically marginalized groups. When understood within social institutions in which coordinated efforts to discredit and discount intellectual traditions, epistemic injustice can take the shape as an institutionalized form of gaslighting. Psychologist E.J. David, in his book Brown Skins, White Minds, inspired by Frantz Fanon's decolonial framework, addresses the mental health of Filipinos in the Philippines and argues that the context of colonization has produced a psychological condition he terms as a colonial mentality among Filipinos, in which Filipinos were taught to see themselves as inferior by denigrating Filipino culture and values. Colonial mentality generates epistemic injustice in two ways. A, it normalizes the view that the marginalized group's epistemic resources have no credibility. And B, it perpetuates the false belief that dominant and Western knowledge is more valuable and thereby more credible. Right? So it's important to note how epistemic injustice even can occur within the context of scientific practices, right? So what are the epistemic dimensions then of voyaging, which is what I want to chart? Like, what would those epistemic frameworks look like, right? The constitutive values, right, that Rebekah was talking about. So I'm going to talk about three different kinds of epistemic skills. One of the ways in understanding the epistemic dimension of voyaging is through a native Hawaiian concept of Hilo. Candace Fujikane articulates one of the most clearest examples of epistemic practice exhibited by the Kanaka Maoli, native Hawaiian people, as Hilo. Quote, the art of Hilo is a keen intergenerational observation and forecasting, key to recording changes on the earth in story and song, and such changes were met with renewed efforts to conserve, protect, and enhance abundance, right? So if you look at that epistemic feature of Hilo, right, that's what scientists do, don't they, right? Isn't that what a lot of scientists are supposed to be doing, is generating these observational skills of the environment? But what makes it different, right, is that there's a moral component to this observation, right? How do we bring in that more, how do we cultivate that moral component in the ways in which we come to know things in this world? So Fujikane's critique of Western capitalism rests upon a distinction of what she interprets as the logic of scarcity and a logic of abundance. A logic of scarcity dictates the movements of settler colonial capitalism on natural entities such as the ocean, which reductively interprets natural environments as wastelands, depriving any animacy and foreclosing any intimacy with elemental nature. Right? A logic of scarcity would deem oceans as static spaces, devoid of vitalism, thereby justifying infrastructures that degrade the ocean environments, such as in Hawaii, the Red Hill fuel tank leakages, nuclear testing. I mean, there was just all this fuel just dumped into the ocean, and it was because they saw the ocean as a wasteland, right? And then there's environmental nuclear testing, commercial pollution, and the heightened militarized presence around the Pacific Ocean. Right. So a logic of abundance seeks to make the space for indigenous methodologies that view nature as familial, as intimate, a relative, an animate member of one's community. And through mo'olelo, or stories, Hilo embodies ancestral knowledge of the living environment that is further transmitted through through generations. And so So that's one skill, is this art of Hilo, just to kind of think about those different ways of understanding knowledge. Oops, sorry. The next is mental maps. Mental maps are generated through perceptions and elements of what many sailors employ as a form of dead reckoning. And according to Huth, a scholar in voyaging, the term dead reckoning emerges from the British Royal Navy around the 17th century. And Huth explains the process of dead reckoning as, quote, you deduce your location through a history of your travels from a starting point to your current location. This requires some sense of orientation, speed, and time and elapsed in the journey. It could also be thought of as a lucky guess. Now, some of these the way that Huth talks about mental maps as a kind of, you kind of create these maps in your mind. What we see here are examples of Carolinian sailors who have developed mental maps on like sticks, and they're called stick maps. And so they would develop what the waves would look like, how they would function relative to where you're at in the sea, and that this can help with one's deducing one's location, right? So on the one hand, mental maps are almost like a lucky guess, but in fact, it can't be considered like a wildly lucky guess, but more like an educated guess, being developed over experience, knowledge of the ocean over time. And then there's the ocean body assemblage. And so within the Pacific Island context, dead reckoning is further enhanced through a cultivation of an oceanic literacy. And so this involves the natural knowledge of the natural world and the ancestral stories embedded in the sea. And so there are two epistemic components to the Hilo of voyaging that Karen Ingersoll articulates as essential in developing an oceanic literacy. She wrote this book called Seascape Epistemology. And it's a fantastic book about her own experience as a philosopher and also as a surfer, what it means, and she's Kanaka Maoli, what it means, how the ocean contributes to knowledge production or produces this form of knowledge. This particular framework she articulates is the ocean body assemblage. So according to Ingersoll, this extends to the body, the canoe, and the ocean, right? The situation as experienced by the navigator. And it involves this sensuous knowledge of elemental nature, right? An oceanic experiential sensibility, which thoughtfully cultivates an intimate attunement to the moon, the tides, the waves, the stars, the clouds, and smell, the sound, the taste of the sea, right? All of those senses come together. And Ingersoll further explains the sight of voyaging emerges through a kinesthetic body in motion in virtue of and then this is the quote, constant interaction between the body and the mind that generates a specific epistemological and ontological context, expanding Bruce Blankenfield, who was one of the captains of the Hokulea, who sailed like around the world, like the whole worldwide voyage of Hokulea, really trying to generate what indigenous narratives of addressing climate change and taking care of the planet, right? So the voyage became their narrative to talk about what it would mean for the world to take seriously indigenous knowledges, right? So Bruce Blankenfield is one of the sailors here, and he talked about including an intimate interaction with the white foam of the open ocean swells that his canoe surfs, a relationship whipped in joy and a freedom of weightlessness through cellular memory, right? Like that relationship, right, between the knower and the known is what the ocean body assemblage is supposed to manifest, right? So this performative and interactive dimension of voyaging emphasizes not a lone and isolated knower on the open ocean who naively embarks towards a seascape that is understood as vast and empty of human values. Rather, a seascape epistemology frames the process of inquiry as deeply informed by other agential knowers, responding to, communicating with the various embodiments of the ocean, the canoe, and the voyaging knower. In fact, according to Ingersoll, the ocean body assemblage expresses the conditions for the possibility, the ontological context of the voyaging knower. Knowledge production entails a community of knowers expanded within the horizon of the interplay between nature and culture. In this sense, voyaging epistemologies integrate both mind and body, joy and freedom through an interactive, sensuous performance exhibited as the art of sailing. The one way to also understand the ocean body assemblage is that the knower becomes an aesthetic subject. So scientists, can you imagine adopting an aesthetic, becoming an aesthetic subject? What would that mean, right? So for Ingersoll, she would argue that it is the role of the imagination that is grounded within a voyaging knower, such that they are able to literally, through their imagination, pull the islands from the sea, right? And of course, in Hawaii, that's a special demigod is able to do that, correct? And that demigod is Maui, right? And so the Mo'olelo of Maui really is Mo'olelo, a story of voyaging. And it talks about that aesthetic subject, right? The aesthetic subject that is able to imagine and pull the islands from the sea, right? In that particular case, so the idea here is that when the cloudy skies obscure the stars or doldrums conceal the waves of the sea, other forms of seeing are deployed. I think that's important to note, right? When one form prevents you from knowing a particular subject, you change directions, you use another form, right? If the wind can't take you sailing, you take up the oars, right? If scientific knowledge is impossible to explain a given anomaly in your phenomena, in the phenomenon that you're studying, you change directions. You need a different framework, right? And so it is developing these new kinds of epistemologies that can help us understand the world, right? So the Mo'olelo of Maui kind of gives us that story to say, we can imagine, we are aesthetic subjects, that we can imagine what the world, right, can look like through these intimate relationships. Let's see. Okay, I'm just gonna almost end there. So the next question is like, how might we understand an ethics emergent from the ocean, right? So from this knowledge, how do we understand an ethics emergent from the ocean? And so the ethical kilo of voyaging develops in response to a precarious environment. An ethical kilo of voyaging extends the epistemic terrain to the realm of ethical actions. Knowing and doing become intertwined actions, right? Opposed to an ethics that demand the domination and control of the ocean, or an ethics of fear that encourage an evasion of one's responsibility to the environment, the ethical kilo of voyaging emphasizes the embodied interaction of the ethical subject, intimately binding one's movement with the sea, right, or the body, and the ethical reflection, the mind. Hence, an ethics that is produced through the interplay of self and elemental nature recognizes the fundamental ambiguity of the sea and the epistemic ability to adapt and renew relationships without falling into an ethics of domination or an ethics of fear. This ethical oceanic literacy exposes the political dimensions and moral roots that the human condition inevitably faces. The ethical kilo of voyaging animates what the human condition is in the face of environmental degradation, settler colonialism, and the struggle for indigenous sovereignty. I did want to end here that the epistemic injustice of voyaging epistemologies in the Pacific has been met with epistemic resistance in the sense that cultures across the Pacific and Oceania have engaged in revitalizing the rich epistemic traditions of voyaging. So it's not just Hawaii anymore. It's like there's all sorts of voyaging cultures and initiatives happening all across Oceania. And so I was lucky to participate, and maybe I can call this up real quick. I was lucky enough to participate in a special journal on voyaging in the Pacific. It is a free teaching journal, and I hope to send this link to you all, because it's really fantastic to to kind of look at, and it's published through the Center of Pacific Island Studies at UH Manoa. But it brings together all of, like, you know, what voyaging in the sea looks like, right? The different authors here, and then, you know, an introduction. It has all of these wonderful videos with links on it, so that you can see the videos of navigators from Fiji. So this guy here is from Fiji, Setariki. And he's doing some wonderful stuff in revitalizing voyaging in Fiji. And then here are like the mental maps, the stick charts. And I draw upon this because it's an important teaching research and learn about voyaging cultures, right? And when we're thinking about like Indigenous knowledges, if you don't know of any communities, if you want to learn more about certain frameworks respectfully, right? There are lots of Indigenous peoples. You know, I mean, if you are a land manager, a conservation land manager in Hawaii, there are opportunities for many of like the Forest Service employees, DLNR, to participate in cultural practices alongside Native Hawaiian groups, right? To help encourage them to learn their Indigenous epistemologies of place, right? So it's important to think, who are your cultural practitioners here, right? In the Oregon coast. What's your relationship, right, to those communities? These are the kinds of questions that you may want to start thinking about when you know, integrating Indigenous knowledges. So anyways, this is just a really great resource to introduce yourself and to others about some of the benefits, or I wouldn't say the benefits, but I would say this is an alive epistemology, right? That isn't reduced to idleness, leisure, and pleasure, right? That these are Indigenous epistemologies that have structure to their reason and credibility to their authority to say something about, you know, the more than human world, right? Especially oceans from my perspective. Okay, I'm gonna end there. But I think we wanted to at least save some time for some questions to see if anybody had any questions. Yes.
2 questions. What's the name of that? Because I really want to download it.
Yeah, yeah, and I will send you the website.
Voyaging in the Pacific. Okay.
Yeah, but it's Voyaging in the Pacific, but it's a free online journal, special issue journal that I got.
Great. I want to learn way more about this. I was a Peace Corps volunteer on a little island in Palau, and my question relates to the talk title, which is
Voyaging epistemology.
right, with ocean and feminism.
Oh, ocean feminism.
And the feminism bit comes in because when I was signing up for Peace Corps, I thought I wanted to be a Peace Corps volunteer on an outer island where I could learn more about traditions that have been, or like cultures less impacted by Western colonialism. And then I realized, after being placed in the main island, in the main city, that I actually wanted to be male on an outer island, and that I would have gone bananas being female because of the constraints, especially in Feist and some other Micronesian islands. There's really rigid gender roles around where you can go and where you're not allowed to go. So my question, it does connect, is how have notions around gender and wayfinding changed over time? Because when I was first learning about this, it was only men who could be the wayfinders. And then I think I read like a year or two ago that there's this woman who's being trained, an Indigenous woman who's now a wayfinder. But I was wondering, like, if you could speak to perhaps changing gender roles at this nexus of wayfinding and feminism.
Yeah, so Actually, in this particular journal, I was just trying to find it. There's a gender and voyaging section on that journal. And what's really interesting is that even in Hawaii, there are these, there had been some strict gender roles between who can be a navigator and who couldn't be a navigator. But now, you know, navigators are women too, right? They've now included navigators as women. And that may also be the case in other islands now. I know of many women navigators across Oceania. So it's not clear whether or not, like, how strict they are in really trying to delimit women from participating in voyaging, you know, activities. But what I do want to say is that there are these concepts of male and female that also are associated with different roles and functions in their society. Now, it doesn't mean that it's patriarchal per se, right? Or there's an assumption of domination. It's just a separate gender roles have separate duties and functions. And many of my Palau students would say that, oh no, we are a matriarchal system. Like the women are the ones, you know, that are in charge here. And so it's very interesting. Yes, they are the ones that have some level of power that I don't think Western patriarchy, you know, we would ever interpret that, you know, having that sort of power. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had kind of on Instagram again. Yeah, thanks for coming. Welcome back to Oregon. It's great to have you. Yeah, I thought that was such an interesting thing too, is like I kept trying to latch onto like, when's the feminism coming? When's the feminism coming?
I was going to talk a little bit about it, but then it didn't. But please, I could talk.
But no, I think it's like so indicative of us and like the heteropatriarchal society that we exist within, that we're looking for like such specific cues for what that looks like and what that doesn't look like, that we oftentimes miss, like where it's innately embedded in certain contexts. I did have a question though. So jumping back to the validation of TEK, I think it's really easy for a lot of us within these academic spaces that exist still in like very white, very attempting to be post-colonialistic context to still latch on to like the exoticism of these different cultures in which we're looking to validate the knowledge of. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that. I mean, I find myself personally getting swept into like your use of sensuous twice. I was like, yes, I want that. That feels good. Where do I get that? Can you like maybe elaborate a little bit on that more? I mean, we've had like since the history of this continent's relationship with Hawaii, it's been like this very exotic gaze, and like how does that continue to exist as we look to validate its TEK, I guess?
No, thank you for that question. Yeah, there is a struggle given the fact that anything about Hawaii, or perhaps even anything about any native culture, right, could be interpreted through a very capitalistic touristic lens. And so it's very difficult to remove one's gaze away from a potential for it to leak it, or to kind of revert into a kind of touristic colonial gaze of cultures. And I think, you know, when we think about our own, like in my case, my own relationship to Hawaii as a settler myself, right, that the idea here is that we have to kind of change. And I think a lot of the indigenous peoples, like even at my university, we have professional developments that say, you know, we're going to teach you some Hawaiian language. We're going to teach you some, you know, activities, cultural practitioner activities. We're all going to, you know, get involved in ritual and ceremonies, that it becomes institutionalized within the university, that it then becomes, well, it's just indigenous culture is just part of the everyday, you know, doing and living at the university, right? And so when I bring people from the outside, you know, not from Hawaii and I did this recently in the summer, for a conference, they are all aware of their own relationship to colonization there, but they come as my guest, people that I will, introduce Hawaii to, right? Versus a tourist guide telling you what Hawaii is, right? So I guess it's very difficult to say that if you don't have a place or a community of Indigenous peoples that you are not cultivating a relationship with, then of course it's going to be hard to imagine what a relationship is going to look like. So I would say connect up with an Indigenous community, and what do they need? What is it that your institution can provide them, and what can you do to just be a part of community in terms of learning about their epistemologies?
I just wanted to add one more thing. So, and maybe give a shout out to Kyle White is a really astonishing, right, Anishinaabe author, and he has a really great piece. What does Indigenous knowledge do for Indigenous people, or what does TEK do for Indigenous persons? And one of the things he points out there is that TEK is there as a way of maintaining sovereignty and relations. So engaging in TEK without engaging in sovereignty efforts that's where that movement comes from. And that's also a really interesting way of pointing out that also Western science is also engaged in practices of sovereignty and power and control, but we don't highlight it there. So it's not that that TEK is involved in politics and sovereignty, and science isn't. It's just that it's much more explicit in that context, and they know like this knowledge is for the preservation of our communities and so in any case, so that's another resource I think focusing on sovereignty and reestablishing sovereignty in politically recognized ways. That's all I'll say.
Well, a couple more minutes.
I guess to go back to the gender roles.
Yes.
So in the experience of women not being allowed to navigate or something in the past, is that the colonial effect, like in that Brown Skin White Minds book for Polynesian culture? Because there is also, is it the Mahu, the third gender, right? So like, could you touch on that, like where people can explore both sides? Or
there was this story, and it's a mo'olelo that Native Hawaiian Voyager was telling, and it's on YouTube, but and she gives this story about how, yes, this is a male activity, but when this one story is that when the men were gone from the boat and all who was left was the women on the boat, on the canoe, and they needed to go for some reason, and so the woman called up a role, like she became the man, right, in order to be able to sail, right, the boat. And I do think that while there are certain roles, it's okay to kind of switch genders. Like the notion of gender is so fluid that we can't just say that that's just a man because you have a body of a man, but that there are masculine roles and there are feminine roles, and some people can do both, and some people can just do one, and maybe sometimes the other, so the gender roles are very fluid and diverse, I would say. And so we can't really categorize things necessarily within an Indigenous framework, especially on sexuality and how a colonial mentality has produced the sex gender the binary sex model, but I don't think that it is applying within this Indigenous concept when they do make gender distinctions. It doesn't function in the same way that it does with the logic of colonialism.
I have a question. I think we're officially finished, so feel free to leave if that feels good for you. But so actually, my question is also a question about feminism, and actually the distinction that you made several times between play and reason, and I can understand why reason is a thing that is, it has been a thing that has been associated with masculinity, and the absence of reason has been a thing that has been used to oppress women, persons of color, non-human animals, right, et cetera. And I'm wondering if rather than saying, no, voyaging is reason, if we might also want to trouble that binary. If one of the feminist moves would be like, no, but it also is play. And we don't have to draw such a firm distinction between play and reason in order to validate this as a form of knowing. So yeah, are there feminist aspects of that kind of destabilizing that binary?
Yeah, so I would say any Indigenous feminist perspective in Oceania is based within a concept, and every like islands would have a different notion of feminism. But in Hawaii, it's known as Manawahine. And Manawahine is a concept of feminism that is antithetical to white Western feminist principles, right? It would be definitely something grounded in empowering women's agency, right? But without this without appealing to like white Western feminism's notion of empowerment, right? So then you have to start to think about, well, what is it that's empowering women, right? And other sexual minorities or gender minorities in Hawaii. Manawahine is focusing on the energy and the power of women's, right? Women's capacities to both reason and play, but also become really jealous. And like, so I think of Pele, the goddess of, and I mean, these are all these kinds of feminine energies of just like, you know, reproduction and like just rage and creation all at once, you know? And I think that's where the ocean, where a lot of Manawahine in particular see the ocean as one of these, I want to like, so one of my colleagues calls the ocean Moana Nui o Akea as the ocean is womb, right? And the womb is us, and we are the ocean, and that there is a feminine power and without getting woo, I don't want to think of this as something that, oh my God, you just have to know it, you know, to be in that religious perspective to understand it. But it is something about articulating women's energy and power, right, emanating within themselves, right? And so the ocean is us. It's kind of like the deity, the ocean goddesses, the you know, all of those energies of the ocean are still you know, part of us, right? And so that's kind of where that's going there. So I do think there's a feminine energy that's grounded within Manawahine as a feminist assertion against settler colonialism. So like the Mauna Kea protest that was happening, I don't know if folks know about that, the 30-meter telescope that was up in Mauna Kea. So Manawahine, Mahu were very present in that activism. And the way they saw that activism wasn't just, this is our ancestor to protect, but that the feminine energy, right, the of aloha aina, right, that sense of the ocean, right, is saying we cannot let this occur, right? This becomes a movement to shape action, right? So the ocean then becomes that metaphor, that place upon which action, right, can be you know, done, especially up in Mauna Kea. So yeah, it becomes a movement of you know, love, self-love, you know, and then that becomes grounded within a community. So I would say that's what an ocean feminism does, is that it really directs Manawahine into actualizing their own personal powers of liberation and agency.
Thank you so much, both of you, Rebecca. And that will end our lunch and learn.
Mahalo, thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I can be the right one. That was too.